The poor nanny, having no one to leave her two autistic children with, had to take them to her first day of work at the millionaire's mansion. But not even 2 minutes passed before the boys disappeared down the huge hallways. Desperate, she searches the entire house until she runs to the garage. And upon opening the door, tears stream down her face as she sees the millionaire doing something with the boys she never imagined. The cold, pre-dawn air of New York City seeped through the cracks of the bus window, raising goosebumps on Helena's skin. But it was nothing compared to the fear that chilled her stomach. Leaning against her shoulders, one on each side, the 6-year-old twins slept the heavy sleep of innocence, oblivious to the turmoil stirring in their mother's heart. Leo snored softly, a gentle sound that was the only melody in the tense silence, while Gail, even in sleep, clutched a crumpled piece of paper where the lines of a yellow car mixed with scribbles of pure imagination. Every jolt of the vehicle as it crossed the Queensboro Bridge felt like a blow to her hopes. This was her last chance. After so many closed doors, so many will-be-in-touch dismissals, this job was the only life raft in an ocean of uncertainty. The money she had left would barely cover the rent on their simple 2-story house in Queens, a place that, despite its small size, was the only safe harbor her children had ever known. When she got off at the final stop, the dampness of a fine drizzle embraced her like an omen. The townhouse on the Upper East Side rose before her not as a home, but as a fortress of high walls and oppressive silence. The lights on in a few windows seemed like distant, indifferent eyes. With the still drowsy boys in hand, Helena pressed the intercom button, and her voice came out trembling, almost a whisper. The massive iron gate slid open noiselessly, revealing a perfectly manicured garden where every leaf seemed to have been placed by decree. The front door opened before she could reach it, and a tall man with an impeccable posture and an indecipherable face appeared under the yellow light of the foyer. It was Arthur, the owner of this immense wealth. A man whose net worth was so vast it could be measured in empty hallways and works of art that were worth more than Helena's entire life. He didn't smile. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, lingering for a moment on the 2 small boys hiding behind her legs. "Ms. Helena, I presume you're 5 minutes early," he said, his voice as controlled as the rest of his appearance. It wasn't a compliment, merely a statement of fact. "I wasn't informed you'd be bringing company." Helena's heart plummeted. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Arthur. I swear this isn't my usual practice, but the person who was going to watch them had an emergency. I had no other choice. They're very quiet, sir. You won't even notice they're here," she said, the words stumbling over each other, the old habit of apologizing for her own existence taking over. Arthur watched her for a moment that seemed to last an eternity. His gaze was a barrier, a wall built with the coldness of someone who had made control his defense mechanism. He stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The house, from the inside, was even colder. It smelled of flowers that didn't grow in the US and polishing wax. The sound of their footsteps echoed on the marble. "See that it doesn't happen again," he decreed, his voice cutting through the air. "My son sleeps upstairs. Your job is to ensure the silence of this house is preserved. I don't tolerate improvisation." He quickly guided her through the kitchen and service area, explaining her duties with the precision of someone reading an instruction manual. Helena just nodded, trying to memorize everything, while her anxious eyes searched for her children every second. Leo and Gail, fascinated by the sheer scale of the place, walked hand in hand, wide-eyed, exploring a world that didn't seem real. Arthur handed her the uniform. "You can change in the service bathroom. Start with the kitchen." He turned to ascend the grand staircase without a second glance. Helena took a deep breath, trying to calm her heart. It was just a job, a difficult job with a demanding boss, but she could handle it. She turned to the boys, a forced smile on her lips, ready to ask them to sit quietly in a corner until she finished. But the hallway was empty. The silence her boss prized so highly now had a terrifying tone. The whisper of their bare feet on the polished floor was gone. A shiver ran down her spine. She called out softly, "Leo? Gael?" No answer. Only the echo of her own anxious voice in the gigantic, empty house. They had vanished. Panic rose in Helena's throat, a tight knot that stole her breath. Where could they have gone? The house was a labyrinth of silent corridors and closed doors, each one a terrible possibility. Her first impulse was to shout their names, but Arthur's command, "Preserve the silence," echoed in her mind like a sentence. She couldn't fail on the first day. In the first few minutes, barefoot so as not to make a sound, she retraced her steps, her heart pounding against her ribs. She looked in the lavish dining room, where a table set for 20 seemed to be waiting for ghosts. She checked the veranda overlooking the dark garden, where the fine drizzle created a veil over the exotic plants. Nothing. The kitchen, with its stainless steel appliances that looked more like surgical equipment, was equally empty. Helena's breath grew short, her hands cold. That silence, once a job requirement, was now her enemy, a predator that had swallowed her children. And then, an inexplicable force, an intuition that only mothers know, pulled her toward a discreet door next to the laundry room. A cold draft was coming from under it, the garage. She pushed it open slowly. The scene that unfolded before her eyes made the world stop spinning. The space was vast, a sanctuary of polished concrete for a collection of cars worth an incalculable fortune. But it wasn't the luxury vehicles that caught her attention. It was the vibrant, almost luminous splash of yellow from a Lamborghini that looked like a creature from another planet. And there, kneeling on the floor beside the car, was Arthur. He was no longer the intimidating boss from the foyer. He was a man on his knees, on the same level as her sons. Leo and Gail stood before him, their faces lit up with a smile so pure and radiant that Helena hadn't seen in months. They were each imitating a driver, their fists clenched around an invisible steering wheel. To elicit that joy, Arthur, the methodical man who didn't tolerate improvisation, was making engine noises with his mouth, a low, guttural vroom vroom that was the most human thing she had ever seen him do. The click of her phone's camera shutter snapped in the silence, capturing the image. And the boys' laughter echoed in the garage, filling the void of that house. Helena felt her legs give way. She leaned against the doorframe, and the tears she had been holding back since she woke up finally came, silent and hot. They weren't tears of relief, or not just that. They were tears of gratitude, of a profound wonder at seeing the unadulterated happiness on her children's faces, a miracle performed by the most unlikely of men. He looked up from his phone, perhaps at the muffled sound of her breath, and saw her. The surprise on his face was genuine. He didn't seem angry at being caught in this moment of vulnerability, just intrigued by the force of her emotion. He stood up, brushing invisible dust from the knee of his tailored slacks. "One of them dropped this in the library," he said, his voice softer now, showing her his phone screen with the photo of Gail's crumpled drawing. "I deduced they had a thing for yellow cars." He gestured for her to come closer. "Come see the pictures. They turned out well." In that instant, an invisible current of tenderness passed between them, something so fragile and unexpected that both instinctively tried to deny it. Helena took a hesitant step inside, her crying now under control, when a third voice, sharp as broken glass, pierced the atmosphere. "Mr. Arthur, is there a problem?" A middle-aged woman, dressed in an impeccable grey suit with her hair in a bun so tight it looked painful, stood in the doorway. It was Beatrice, the household manager. Her gaze swept over Helena with ill-disguised contempt before settling on Arthur. "The new employee should be starting her duties in the kitchen. We cannot allow the routine to be compromised." The word routine sounded like an accusation, and her glance toward the twins made it clear that they were the mess she so feared. Beatrice represented the cold order of that house, and Helena, with her children and her emotions, was disorder personified. The tension Beatrice left in the garage lingered in the air for days. Helena felt the manager's eyes following her every move, a cold surveillance that made her measure her gestures and lower her voice. She knew she was on fragile ground, where any misstep could mean the end. But the smile on her children's faces, that image seared into her memory, was a fuel stronger than fear. She couldn't erase their joy to fit into the sterile frame of that house, and it was with this certainty that, on her day off, she took the crowded subway to a craft superstore in Queens, her heart pounding with a bold plan. With the little money she had, she bought colored cardstock, refrigerator magnets, scraps of fabric with different textures, velvet, sandpaper, silk, and a small pair of children's noise-canceling headphones. It was a modest investment, but one that carried the capital of all her hope. The next day, the guest room, an anonymous and lifeless space designated for her and the boys during the day, began to transform. On the wall, she fixed a large visual clock made of cardstock, where tasks were represented by drawings: a sun for breakfast, a book for story time, a moon for rest. Beside it, she set up a routine board with magnets, allowing Leo and Gail to participate in organizing their own time, a small act of control that was immense for them. In a corner, she created a sensory box, a refuge of textures where they could plunge their hands when the world became too loud. The mansion, which once smelled of imported flowers and silence, began to acquire new scents. In the morning, the smell of baking banana bread mingled with that of freshly brewed coffee. In the afternoon, as rain tapped against the veranda windows, the sound was that of her whispered stories, no longer the echo of footsteps on marble. Arthur started coming home earlier. The official excuse was always pending business, a video conference with European investors, but his feet invariably led him near the kitchen or the guest room. He would lean against the doorframe, pretending to read emails on his phone, but he was really watching how the house had changed its sound, how the oppressive silence had been replaced by a soft melody of life. One day, he saw her drawing with the boys. They weren't scribbles, they were firm lines full of talent. He approached, curious. "You draw well," he commented, his voice devoid of its usual irony. Helena blushed. "It's just a hobby." It was then that he noticed a notebook beside her, filled with notes. They were detailed records of her children's behavior. What calmed them, what agitated them, their small progresses. He, a man who had built his fortune analyzing charts and stock spreadsheets, recognized the method. But here, the analysis wasn't aimed at profit, it was aimed at affection. That same afternoon, while tidying a book Gail had dropped in the immense library, Helena found a wooden box forgotten on a low shelf. Inside were black and white photographs, not posed family portraits, but street scenes, the faces of market vendors, the wrinkled hands of laborers, children running in the drizzle. The images pulsed with a life and emotion that starkly contrasted with the owner of the house. When he appeared, she startled, thinking she had invaded his privacy. "I'm sorry, He just looked at the photos in her hands. "An old passion," he said, his voice tinged with a melancholy she had never heard. From before, life demanded a tie and a diversified asset portfolio. The confession created a fragile bridge between them, a recognition that they were both more than the roles they played. But the bridge was dynamited when Beatrice entered the library, her face a mask of indignation. She held one of the sensory toys as if it were evidence of a crime. "Mr. Arthur, I need to speak with you, in private. It concerns the unprofessional turn this environment has taken." The air in the library grew thick, heavy with Beatrice's disapproval. Arthur looked at the woman, then at Helena, who instinctively shrank back. the notebook and old photographs suddenly feeling too heavy in her hands. The manager's gaze was accusatory, turning the sensory corner into a serious infraction, an act of insubordination that shattered the mansion's aseptic order. "Unprofessional," Arthur repeated, his eyebrows slightly arched, a subtle sign of an annoyance that only he knew how to perfectly conceal. Beatrice lifted her chin, feeling backed by years of loyal service and the maintenance of a standard of efficiency she believed was the pillar of that house. "Sir, the residence is turning into a daycare. Toys in plain sight, the smell of homemade food at unscheduled times. This compromises the serious image we have always cultivated, especially with the business guests and investors you receive. It could affect the perception of your business, of your net worth." Helena felt the floor disappear from under her. Every word from Beatrice was a hammer blow to her attempt to build a safe harbor for her sons in this place. She braced for the worst, for the inevitable dismissal. Arthur, however, remained silent for a long moment, his eyes moving from the toy in Beatrice's hand to the colorful routine chart visible from the hallway. He, a man who had built his empire, his billion-dollar fortune, on rigid rules and the elimination of unpredictable variables, was now facing a different kind of cash flow, the flow of life that Helena had brought into his home. "Beatrice," he said finally, his voice calm but with a thread of steel she had never heard before. "The house is different, and that is not up for discussion. Helena stays." The manager was aghast, the shock breaking her composure for a fraction of a second. It was the first time he had ever overruled her. She recomposed her professional mask, but her eyes shot Helena a silent promise of war. Beatrice left the library without another word, but the defeat in her posture was evident. Arthur, however, turned to Helena, and the hardness in his gaze had not entirely disappeared. He felt insecure, exposed by a decision that followed none of his business logic. "This doesn't mean the rules are gone," he said, raising a wall again. "Do you one thing I demand. No pictures of the boys on social media. None. The privacy of my family and of everyone who lives in this house is non-negotiable." Helena nodded, relieved and at the same time hurt by his distrust. She would never do such a thing, but she understood it was his way of regaining control. On Sunday, the first day off they spent together outside the mansion walls, Helena took the boys to a street fair in Brooklyn. The place was buzzing with colors, sounds and smells. Gail, who usually withdrew from excessive stimuli, seemed fascinated by the craft stalls. On a corner, an accordion player played a lively folk tune, his feet tapping the rhythm on the asphalt. He smiled at the children and beckoned them to clap along. Leo, the more expansive of the two, soon joined other children, clapping awkwardly but with a huge smile. Arthur, who had accompanied them at a calculated distance, watched from afar. He saw when the musician approached Gail, who had hidden behind Helena. The musician said nothing, just held out his hand. And then the small miracle happened. Gail, who had always been resistant to the touch of strangers, looked at the accordion player's hand, then at Arthur's, and reached out his own. Arthur moved closer and took the small hand. In that touch, in that simple, profound connection, he felt a pang in his heart. A pain made of gratitude and all the years of lost touches. On the way back, another small urban magic. Stopped at a red light, a yellow VW Bug, impeccably maintained, pulled up alongside their car. Leo and Gail, in unison, shouted from their car seats, "It's the same." It wasn't the same as the Lamborghini, but it was yellow. And for them, the color was the connection. Arthur, caught off guard by their joy, laughed, a genuine laugh that lit up his face. "Or did you know I once shot an entire series just on classic cars?" he revealed, more to himself than to them. The history the city holds on to. Helena, in the passenger seat, watched him in the rearview mirror. In that instant, she saw a glimpse of the man behind the multi-millionaire. the photographer of souls hidden under layers of interest rate spreadsheets and dividend reports. And she felt a dangerous pull toward that glimpse. A curiosity she knew she had to suppress at all costs. The school carnival exploded in a vibrant chaos of colors and sounds. Colorful paper streamers trembled in the wind, the smell of popcorn and cotton candy mixed in the air, and the loud pop music hammered out a rhythm that for most was infectious, but for Leo and Gail was an avalanche. Helena kept them close, one on each side, her hands firm in theirs. In her bag, a pair of noise-cancelling headphones was at the ready. Her contingency plan for the sensory overload she knew was an imminent possibility. Arthur was with them, a fish out of water in his impeccable linen shirt, out of place among the parents in t-shirts and sneakers. He had come out of a newfound sense of obligation, a curiosity to observe the dynamics of this universe that, until then, was just an item on his monthly expense sheet, categorized as education. He watched Helena's effort to turn the overwhelming event into an adventure, pointing to the colored lights and the ring toss booth. The trigger came without warning. The pop of a firecracker, thrown by an older boy, coincided with the loudest chorus of the music and a careless bump from someone rushing past. It was too much for Leo. He dropped his mother's hand, clapped both hands over his ears, and began to rock back and forth. His eyes squeezed shut, a low moan escaping his lips. The world had become too aggressive. Helena acted on instinct. She crouched in front of him, blocking the crowd with her body, and began to speak in a low, rhythmic tone, her voice an anchor in the storm. "Leo, look at Mommy. Take a deep breath. We're right here." But before she could calm him, a figure loomed over them. It was the school principal, a woman with a permanent smile that didn't reach her eyes, motivated solely by protecting the institution's flawless image. "Is there a problem here, Helena?" she asked, her tone falsely solicitous, but her eyes scanned the scene with impatience. "He's just tired," Helena tried to explain, reaching for the headphones in her bag. The principal cut her off with a wave of her hand. "Honey, sometimes these helicopter mums do more harm than good. If you just let him integrate more, expose him to these situations. He wouldn't make such a scene every time." The accusation, spoken loud enough for other parents to hear, was like a slap. Helena felt her face burn with humiliation. She was the one to blame, the mother who didn't know how to raise her own child. Arthur, who had been watching, felt a chill. The social pressure was palpable. The curious stares, the whispers. His first instinct, the instinct of a businessman who solves problems by eliminating the disruptive variable, was to agree, to ask Helena to take the boys home, to end the scene. He took a step forward, his mouth opening to say exactly that. But then he saw it. In the midst of his distress, Leo was trying to follow his homework. His small hand trembled, but he brought it to his own belly, placing 2 fingers over his navel, just as Helena had taught him. He inhaled deeply, his small chest filling with air, and exhaled slowly. It was an imperfect copy of the breathing exercise, but it was an attempt. It was proof that Helena's method wasn't overprotection. It was a tool. She wasn't isolating him from the world. She was giving him weapons to face it. In that instant, the injustice of the principal's accusation hit him with the force of a stock market crash. The woman didn't see a child struggling. She saw an image problem. He moved, no longer hesitating. He stood between the principal and his makeshift family. "The only one causing a disruption here is you," he said, his voice low but sharp. "Your complete lack of preparation for dealing with a child is the real problem." He then made a decision. He wouldn't be a simple donor. He would be an agent of change. He would secretly fund the best inclusion training his money could buy for that school. But as he turned to guide Helena and the boys to the exit, his gaze met that of one of the school's most influential parents, a man who had clearly heard his affront to the school's authority. The man's icy stare was a promise that this battle was far from over. Arthur's decision to fund the inclusion training for the school, though done quietly, created shockwaves he hadn't anticipated. The principal, humiliated on her own turf, and the group of influential parents, who saw the Millionaire's action as a direct criticism of the status quo they defended, began a subtle campaign of resistance. Vicious comments about the P-problem children and the interfering nanny started circulating in private message groups, painting Helena as a social climber using her children to manipulate a rich, lonely man. The social doors that once opened for Arthur with reverence began to creak shut. Invitations to events dwindled, and the stairs in the few places he frequented were a mixture of curiosity and judgment. The fortress he had built around his life was being besieged, not by competitors in the capital markets, but by a much more insidious force: prejudice. He felt the pressure, but the image of Leo taking a deep breath at the carnival was a stronger shield than any profitability report. To make matters worse, Arthur's past decided to come knocking. Lucy, an ex-fiancée who belonged to the same social circle that now ostracized him, reappeared. Driven by a mix of wounded vanity and the convenience of reconnecting with an immense source of wealth, she sought him out under the pretext of offering support. Lucy was the personification of the life Arthur had left behind: superficial, obsessed with appearances, and ruthless in maintaining her position. Sitting in the mansion's living room, she glanced at one of the boys' drawings on the coffee table with a slight turn of her nose. "Darling, I understand your charity," she said, her voice syrupy, "but you need to be careful. I've heard things about this woman. They say she has a history of seducing employers to get what she wants. A very trusted friend of mine told me she's tried this before." The lie was so absurd, so cruel, that Arthur felt a wave of revulsion. He knew Lucy. He knew her trusted friend was likely herself, inventing a story to poison the well. He cut her off with a coldness that made her flinch. "Your time here is over, Lucy." But the damage was done. The slander, once uttered, took on a life of its own. The rumor spread like wildfire, reinforcing the narrative the school parents had already created. Helena was no longer just the nanny. She was the gold digger. She felt the shift in the air. At the upscale neighborhood bakery, the clerk who was once friendly now barely looked her in the eye. Mothers at the school gate pulled their children closer when she walked by. The isolation was an invisible wall suffocating her, and the fear that the rumor would reach Arthur's ears and he would believe it was a constant torment. Seeing the sadness settle over her and, consequently, over the boys, Arthur decided to call a truce. One evening, he dismissed Beatrice early and announced they were having a movie night. But not just any movie night. It would be a yellow movie night. He and Helena dragged cushions onto the floor of the screening room, which normally only showed European art films or documentaries on the financial market. Helena made mango juice, yellow as the sun, and buttered popcorn. Arthur, using his vast digital collection, projected an animated movie about talking cars onto the giant screen, where the hero was, of course, a little yellow car. The lights were low, the sound adjusted so as not to be overwhelming. Leo and Gail, in their pajamas, lay on the cushions, completely absorbed in the magic. At the end of the film, as the credits rolled, a moment of pure connection occurred. Gail, who rarely initiated verbal contact to express emotions, turned to Helena, looked directly into her eyes, and said, with a clarity that made her heart race, "Thank you, Mommy." Then he turned to Arthur, who was sitting a little further away, and repeated, "Thank you." The simple word, laden with immense effort and overwhelming sincerity, hit Arthur with full force. He felt an uncontrollable urge to stand up, go to Helena, and hug her, to physically share the emotion of that small, great miracle. But he held back. He just bit his lip. The emotion caught in his throat and nodded. The walls he had built were too high, and the fear of what that feeling meant was, in that moment, greater than the joy. The morning after the yellow movie night dawned differently. A lightness that Helena hadn't felt since she first set foot in that house seemed to have seeped in with the first rays of sunlight. Gael's "thank you" still echoed in her ears. A small gold medal worth more than all the assets stored in Arthur's vaults. For the first time, he didn't eat his breakfast isolated in his office, reading stock market reports. He sat at the kitchen table with them, in a comfortable silence, watching Leo try, with monumental concentration, to spread jam on a piece of toast. When the boy finally succeeded, Arthur smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile, but one that Helena saw and cherished. In that small gesture, she felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build something real in that place. A routine of affection that could overcome the barriers of class and their mutual fears. That moment of peace, however, was merely the calm before the storm. Later, taking advantage of the shy sun that had appeared, Arthur had an impulse. "How about a real ride?" he asked, looking at the yellow Lamborghini, which had become a totem of the boys' joy. The idea was simple: a slow drive around the block, just so they could feel the wind on their faces. It was a huge step for him, a break in his methodical routine, an act driven purely by the desire to see his sons smile again. Helena hesitated for a second, the fear of exposure battling the desire to give them that joy, but the sparkle in Leo and Gail's eyes won. The ride was brief and magical. The boys' laughter inside the car was the only music they needed. But they weren't alone. From the window of a passing car, a phone was raised, a digital influencer, specializing in luxury cars and the lives of multi-millionaires, recognized Arthur and his iconic machine. He didn't see the full scene, didn't see the tenderness. He only saw the opportunity. The bomb exploded in the early afternoon. The video, shot at a glance, with no clear audio, showed only the absurdly expensive car, the notoriously wealthy man, and 2 children. The caption was venomous and calculated to go viral. How far does the flaunting go? Billionaire Arthur Prado uses kids, reportedly with special needs, to show off his new multi-million-dollar toy. Anything for the likes. Within hours, the video was a wildfire. Angry comments multiplied, accusing him of exploitation, of insensitivity, of using his own children's condition to promote himself. The happy photo he kept on his phone like a treasure had become a weapon against him. His publicist, a pragmatic man named Davis, arrived at the mansion with the urgency of someone dealing with a reputation crisis that could decimate his stock value. Davis got straight to the point in the coldness of a boardroom. "Arthur, this is a disaster. It's tarnishing your image, your businesses. Investors hate family instability. We need to cut this off at the source." Arthur, pale, tried to argue. "But it was just a ride." Davis interrupted him. "Nobody cares about the truth. Perception is reality. And the perception is that this woman, the nanny, is the center of the problem. Since she arrived, your life has become a circus. The school carnival, the rumors, she's the unstable element. We need to remove her, at least until the dust settles. We issue a statement saying she was terminated for inappropriate behavior and that you're taking steps to protect your children." Arthur froze. Remove Helena. Accuse her. It was unthinkable. But Davis's pressure, the cold logic of crisis management, cornered him. He looked at his publicist, his mind torn between protecting his empire and protecting the woman who was teaching him how to feel again. And, for the first time, he hesitated. I need to think." Helena, who had been called to the room and heard Davis's sentence from the doorway, felt her world collapse. Arthur's hesitation was the final stab. He hadn't defended her. He saw her as Davis saw her, a liability, a risk to be managed. The pain of betrayal was so sharp, it suffocated all other emotions. With the dignity she didn't know she possessed, she took a step forward. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. Her eyes met his. And what he saw there was a disappointment so profound it would mark him forever. She took her employee ID badge from her pocket and placed it gently on the polished mahogany table. The sound of plastic on wood was the only noise in the room. "I am not a problem to be managed, Mr. Arthur," she said, her voice firm but thick with pain. "I resign." And she turned her back, walking out of the room, out of that house, leaving behind a silence heavier and colder than any that mansion had ever known. The silence Arthur had once prized now haunted him. After Davis left, satisfied with having solved the crisis, a vacuum settled into the mansion, one that the echo of Arthur's own footsteps couldn't fill. The smell of imported flowers once again dominated the air, but now it seemed like the scent of a funeral. For the first time, he noticed how the house was too big, too cold, too empty. The absence of Helena and the boys wasn't just an absence of people, it was an absence of a soul. The life that she, with her simple gestures and routine of affection, had breathed into those rooms had left with her, leaving behind only the opulent shell of his wealth. His net worth was astronomical, but the value of his home, in that moment, was zero. The next morning, chaos ensued. Without the visual schedule Helena had created, Leo and Gail woke up disoriented. Arthur, in the arrogance of a man who believes any system can be replicated, tried to take charge. He went to the magnet board, which Helena had left behind, and tried to follow the order. But he didn't understand the logic behind the sequence. To him, they were just tasks. He put the playtime magnet before breakfast, thinking it would be an incentive. The result was a crying fit from Leo, who couldn't process the break in the structure that was his safety. Arthur then tried breakfast. He remembered the smell of banana bread and, confident, tried to bake some from a mix. Distracted by a notification from the Asian stock market on his phone, he forgot about it in the oven. Black smoke and the acrid smell of burning filled the kitchen, setting off the smoke alarm and Gail's panic, who cowered under the table, hands over his ears. The afternoon was even worse. He tried to read a story, picking up one of the books Helena read to them, but his voice was monotone, his words read, not felt. He didn't make the dramatic pauses, didn't change his voice for each character, didn't whisper the plot secrets. The boys, who would be mesmerized by her narration, now wandered off in less than 5 minutes, leaving him alone with the open book in his lap. It was the final defeat. There, sitting on the expensive library rug, surrounded by a cultural and financial capital that could move nations, Arthur Prado felt like the most incompetent of men. He, the billionaire who understood compound interest and cryptocurrency fluctuations, didn't know how to comfort his own children. He realized with painful clarity that what Helena had built wasn't a service, it was a sanctuary, and he, out of fear and pride, had demolished it. Meanwhile, miles away, in the small house in Queens, Helena was starting over. With the same cardstock and cheap magnets, she recreated the routine chart on her living room wall. It was smaller, simpler, but it was theirs. She was hurt, her heart broken by Arthur's silent betrayal, but her priority was her son's well-being. She had to rebuild their world, even if hers was in ruins. At night, after finally getting the boys to sleep, exhausted from the day's emotional turmoil, Helena allowed herself to cry. A silent cry of pure exhaustion and loneliness. That's when she heard the knock on the door. It wasn't the neighbor asking for a cup of sugar, nor the pizza delivery guy. It was a firm, assertive knock from someone who didn't belong in that place. With her heart in her throat, she opened it a crack. Standing under the dim light of the streetlight was a man she hadn't seen in almost 6 years, a ghost from her past. It was Richard, the twins' biological father, and he wasn't smiling. Richard's face was the same one that haunted her memories, but the ambition in his eyes was new. a cold glint she didn't recognize. He didn't bring nostalgia, he brought a business proposal. "Helena, I heard about your situation," he began, his voice rehearsed to sound sympathetic. "And I want to help. I want to be a part of my sons' lives." The venom was in how he said "my sons," as if they were a newly discovered asset in his portfolio. He explained bluntly that he now worked on the team of a politician in the middle of an election campaign, a man who championed family values. Richard's appearance as a repentant father, fighting to reconnect with his special needs children, would be a goldmine for the campaign. "We're going to file for joint custody," he announced, as if closing a deal. "It's good for everyone's image. And I've brought a lawyer to make sure everything goes smoothly." The threat was clear. If she didn't cooperate, he would crush her with the weight of the legal and media machine he now had at his disposal. Helena felt her body go cold. She had no money, no connections, nothing but the love for her sons. Fear made her shrink, retreat into herself, the prey before the predator. In the Upper East Side mansion, guilt gnawed at Arthur. Every silence, every empty room was a mirror of his cowardice. The image of Helena placing her ID on the table replayed in his mind, a film loop of his own failure. He looked at the reports from his investment funds, at the profitability charts of his stocks, and saw only empty numbers. The only dividend that mattered, the only real wealth he had experienced in years, was the joy in that house. And he had sacrificed it to protect assets, to manage liabilities, to appease a heartless market. In that moment, he made a decision that would change the course of everything. He declined Davis's insistent calls. He ignored Lucy's messages. He no longer wanted image consultants or social alliances. He wanted to fix what he had broken. Using the vast resources he normally employed to track businesses and capital opportunities, he asked his head of security a single question: "Where does she live?" When Arthur's luxury car pulled up in front of the simple house in Queens, the scene looked like a collision of two universes. He got out, his expensive suit looking like a costume in this real-life setting. As he approached the partially open door, he heard a man's voice, arrogant and pressuring, and Helena's almost inaudible reply. His heart tightened with a fiercely protective feeling. He knocked. When Helena opened the door and saw him, her face was a mixture of shock, fear, and exhaustion. Richard, inside the living room, fell silent, surprised by the appearance of the famous billionaire. Arthur ignored him. His eyes were fixed on Helena. "I'm so sorry," he said, and the sincerity in his voice disarmed all her defenses. "I was a coward, and I left you unprotected." He glanced at Richard with contempt. "I know I have no right, but I want to help. A lawyer, the best my money can buy. But the final decision, every step, will be yours. No control, no emotional contract." Helena stared at him, seeing not the boss, but the man, the one who made engine noises to make her sons smile. She saw the genuine guilt in his eyes, and in his offer, she saw not charity, but a plea for redemption, and it was there that she found her strength. "I don't want your money, Arthur," she said, her voice firm for the first time that night. "I won't be an item on your expense list or a high-risk investment. I only need one thing. I just need to be heard." She looked from Arthur to Richard, determination growing inside her. Richard, sensing the tables had turned, backed down, promising his lawyers would be in touch. When he left, Helena and Arthur stood in the silence of the small living room. "A partnership then?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded. "Yes, a partnership." The war for the custody of her children had been declared, but for the first time, Helena didn't feel like she was fighting on the front lines alone. The meeting at Family Services was marked by a cold, bureaucratic tension, a far cry from the media spectacle Richard had planned. The room was small, the table light wood, and the air smelled of old paper and human problems. On one side, Helena and Arthur, an unlikely alliance that defied all social logic. On the other, Richard and his lawyer, armed with the sharp rhetoric of politics and the assumption that their candidate's financial power would solve everything. But Helena had a different kind of capital, the truth. She didn't bring expensive lawyers who spoke in legal jargon. She brought documents, detailed reports from the therapists who had worked with the boys since their diagnosis, handwritten letters from former teachers who testified to her tireless dedication, and most importantly, her notebook. The same one Arthur had seen in the library, filled with daily notes, with meticulous observations about the progress, the struggles, and the small victories of Leo and Gail. While Richard's lawyer pontificated about the father's rights and the importance of a paternal image, Helena, with a serenity that surprised even herself, opened the notebook. She made no accusations. She just read. She read about how she discovered that the sound of rain calmed Gail, that the color yellow was a safe harbor for Leo. She described the struggle to teach them how to hold a fork, the joy of the first time they responded to a good morning. Her voice was not that of a victim. It was the voice of a mother, a report that was both technical and deeply loving, painting an unquestionable picture of care, routine, and dedication. The court mediator, an experienced woman, listened in silence, her eyes fixed on Helena. Arthur, beside her, remained a rock, his silent support more eloquent than any speech. Richard's strategy began to crumble. The present father narrative was dissolving before the overwhelming evidence of a mother who had never been absent. Realizing the exposure could backfire on his boss's campaign, turning him into a villain trying to take children from their mother for political gain, Richard retreated. He agreed to a supervised visitation arrangement, a clear defeat disguised as a concession. On the way back, they didn't take Arthur's armored sedan. At Helena's request, they took the subway. It was important for her to return to her reality, not to be seduced by a world that wasn't hers. In the crowded car, the rocking of the train pushed them against each other. At one point, Arthur reached up to grab the support bar above her head, and with his other hand, instinctively shielded the space around her, a human shield against the jolts and shoves of the crowd. It was a small, automatic gesture that involved no money, no business, no power. It involved care, a gesture worth more than 1,000 promises. In that forced proximity, surrounded by strangers, they shared a silence that was no longer awkward, but one of complicity. That night, the mansion felt less cold. The victory in court, though exhausting, had left a sense of peace. In the kitchen, under the warm light from the cabinets, Helena was making chamomile tea. Arthur came in, barefoot, his tie loosened. He watched her for a moment, the steam rising from the mug, the scent of herbs filling the air. "You know," he began, his voice low, almost a confession. "In those photos you saw in the library, I used to dream of doing that forever, photographing people, joy, the life that happens when no one is posing. But the family business grew, the responsibility, and objects became safer than people." Helena turned, the warm mug between her hands. "And I always dreamed of having a space, a studio in my neighborhood," she confessed in return. "A sensory space, with textures, lights, and sounds, where kids like mine could play without being judged, a place where parents could just breathe." The exchange of dreams, of vulnerabilities, created a new connection between them. And in the middle of that conversation, like a seed planted in fertile soil, the idea that would change everything was born. "What if," Arthur said, his eyes shining with an enthusiasm she had never seen, "the children were the artists? An inclusive photography project. The tool for their future had just been forged." The final week arrived with the urgency of a countdown to the rest of their lives. The inclusive photography project, born from a late-night confession in the kitchen, took shape with astonishing speed. Arthur threw himself into the initiative with the same focus he had once dedicated to analyzing stock market fluctuations, but now the profit he sought couldn't be measured in dollars or euros. Helena, in turn, was the soul of the project, translating the children's needs into practical actions, creating an environment where the camera was not a technical tool, but an extension of their curiosity. The mansion, once a sanctuary of silence, now echoed with the clicks of disposable cameras and the laughter of Leo and Gail as they discovered the world through a lens. But the newfound harmony was fragile, and Beatrice, the former manager, watched from afar, her resentment growing like interest on an unpaid debt. She saw Helena's return not as a reconciliation, but as a usurpation. In her mind, this simple woman was squandering the legacy of order and prestige she had spent years building. Her counterattack was subtle and venomous. She started by spreading a rumor among her contacts and the remaining staff. She got what she wanted, now she's just going to coast. Any day now she'll turn up pregnant to secure the inheritance. The slander was low, but effective, creating a climate of mistrust that Helena felt like tiny pinpricks on her skin. When Arthur discovered the sabotage, from the gardener who had overheard the talk and felt a sincere affection for Helena, the fury he felt was cold and decisive. He summoned all the household staff to the living room and G, with Helena by his side, declared, "The trust I have in Helena is one of the most valuable assets in this house. Anyone who doesn't agree with that no longer needs to work for me." The silence that followed was one of pure respect. Beatrice's war, fought from the shadows, was over. The next step was to take the project beyond the mansion walls. In a neighborhood park, they set up a small test exhibition with simple panels displaying the boys' first photos. The response was immediate and warm. People didn't just see shaky images, they saw a child's unique perspective, the beauty and the detail of a yellow leaf on the ground, the joy in the unfocused blur of a swing. The school principal, who heard about the event, showed up. Seeing the positive community reaction and the genuine beauty of the project, she understood its potential, not just as a tool for inclusion, but as a valuable investment for the school's own image. With a humility no one expected from her, she approached and made a proposal. The school would like to join and support the initiative. The bridge that had been burned at the school carnival was rebuilt. With all external resistance finally overcome, they focused on the grand finale. The mansion's main hall, once a space of cold formality, was transformed. The photos, now printed in larger formats, were hung on the walls, replacing the priceless works of art. Warm lights were installed. A smell of pound cake wafted from the kitchen. Invitations were delivered throughout the neighborhood, not just to the elite. And then, the moment arrived. Helena, her heart in her throat, smoothed down the simple dress she was wearing. Arthur, standing beside her, loosened his collar, more nervous than he'd ever been closing a multi-million-dollar deal. They heard the doorbell ring. The first guests were arriving. The hall was ready, the photos were waiting, and the door was about to open on the final verdict of their journey. The doors of the mansion opened, and it wasn't the city's elite who entered, but the neighborhood. Neighbors from Helena's building in Queens, parents from the school who once looked at her with suspicion, vendors from the street fair, all drawn by curiosity and the promise of a different kind of evening. The smell of warm pound cake overlaid the distant scent of flowers, and the sound that filled the hall was not classical music, but animated conversations and children's laughter. Arthur and Helena stood side by side, not as boss and employee, but as curators of a small miracle. He, who had built his fortune on the premise that control was the key to success, felt himself floating on a current of events he couldn't control, but which was carrying him to an infinitely better place. The profitability of this night wouldn't be measured in charts, but in smiles. People walked slowly through the hall, pausing before the photographs. There was a reverent silence before the images, a shaky close-up of a dog's paw, the reflection of the sun in a puddle, the detail of a small hand holding a yellow crayon. They were fragments of a world seen from below, with a disarming purity. Arthur watched an elderly woman, one of Helena's neighbors, cry softly in front of a photo of the twins, intertwined hands. "It's just that they never used to touch like that," she whispered to her husband. The school principal, a glass of juice in her hand, approached Arthur. "I never understood," she said, with surprising sincerity, "and now I see. This is an emotional asset." The word asset hit Arthur in a new way. He had spent his life accumulating property, but this exhibition, this moment, was the most valuable thing he had ever owned. His eyes searched for Helena. She was crouched down, explaining to Leo and Gail how happy people were to see their art. The boys, though a little overwhelmed by the crowd, were beaming with pride. It was then that the moment that would redefine everything happened. Gail, with quiet determination, left his mother's side and walked through the guests. He was holding a carefully folded piece of paper. He stopped in front of Arthur and, with the solemnity of someone handing over a treasure, held out his hand. Arthur knelt, his heart racing. He took the paper and unfolded it. It was a drawing, 3 stick figures, lopsided and colorful, one tall, one medium, and one small, holding hands under a yellow sun. And underneath, in shaky handwriting, the result of weeks of effort, was a short phrase: "Thank you for the pictures, Daddy." The air left Arthur's lungs. The word Daddy hit him not as a sound, but as a shockwave that shattered all his defenses. It wasn't a biological title, it was a medal of honor. It was the recognition of a place he didn't know he had been trying to fill. He swallowed the sob rising in his throat, a knot of all his losses, all his loneliness, all his dammed-up love. His fingers traced the letters on the paper, the most precious asset he had ever held. He raised his tear-filled eyes to Gail, who smiled a shy, triumphant smile. And then he looked across the hall, over the heads of the people, and his eyes met Helena's. She was watching him, tears streaming freely down her face, not of sadness, but of complete and utter understanding. In that gaze, he finally understood the name of the feeling he had been so forcefully denying. It wasn't gratitude, not affection, not partnership. It was love, a love that builds a family where there was none. He took a step toward her, the drawing in his hand, and the entire world seemed to disappear. The noise of the exhibition faded to a distant hum, background noise to the universe that had shrunk to the space between Arthur and Helena. He took one step, then another, Gail's drawing in his hand like a compass guiding him through the crowd, which parted for him instinctively. When he finally reached her, there were no words, just the sound of their breathing and the raw truth that passed between their eyes. He didn't need to say he loved her. She saw in his tear-filled eyes the capitulation of a man who had spent his life building walls and now watched them crumble, grain by grain, before the power of a child's drawing. The last guest began to leave, leaving behind a trail of compliments and half-eaten slices of cake. The house slowly returned to silence, but it was a new silence, filled with a vibrant expectation. When they were alone, the boys already asleep upstairs, exhausted from the emotion, Arthur led her by the hand to the kitchen, the place where their dreams had first met. He placed the drawing on the wooden table next to a forgotten mug of tea. "My whole life," he began, his voice hoarse, "I've measured my success in numbers, stocks, profitability, the growth of my net worth. I built a fortune thinking it would protect me, that it was the only legacy that mattered. But this piece of paper," he touched the drawing with his fingertips, "this is the only asset with real value. Helena, I don't want to be a billionaire who visits his own life on weekends anymore. I don't want to manage my business from afar. I want to be here." It wasn't a marriage proposal, not a cliched declaration of love. It was something much deeper. It was the renunciation that validated the transformation. "I've decided to cut my travel by 80%. I'm going to restructure the company, sell off some of my overseas investments. The capital I used to expand my business. I want to invest it here, in us." He looked at her, his vulnerability exposed. "Your dream, the sensory studio. I want to make it real. I'll open a social outreach wing in my company, an arm of the foundation, and you'll be the director, not as a favor, but as a partnership. You will have your space, your independence, your purpose. I don't want to be your savior. I just want the chance to walk beside you, to share the stage, not the spotlight, on the children's time, on our time." Helena listened, her heart beating a calm, strong rhythm. The woman who had arrived here apologizing for existing was now listening to a man offer to dismantle his empire for a chance to build a home with her. The tears that came were of relief, of a peace she had never imagined possible. She reached out and placed her hand over his, which still rested on the drawing. "I accept," she said, her voice firm, "but on one condition." He looked at her, ready to give her the world. "That none of this changes what brought us here. I want us to keep building everything with routine, with respect, and with truth. I want the smell of banana bread in the morning, story time in the afternoon, and honesty in difficult conversations at night. I want our wealth to be made of that." He smiled, a smile that finally reached his eyes. "It's the best deal of my life." The conflict had dissolved, not in an explosion, but in an agreement of souls, sealed on the promise of an ordinary and extraordinary life. The promise made in the kitchen hung between them, sacred and silent. Arthur held out his hand, and Helena took it without hesitation, his fingers laced with hers. A connection that was both new and strangely familiar. He led her out of the kitchen, through the now dark and quiet corridors of the mansion. The silence was no longer the same. It wasn't the oppressive absence that had greeted her on that first morning. It was a soft peace, a space to breathe, the sound of a sleeping home. Every step they took together on the cold marble was a step that rewrote the history of the place, transforming a monument to loneliness into a sanctuary of affection. He didn't lead her to the grand staircase or the living room, but to the discreet door that led to the garage, the place where it all began. The automatic light flickered on with a soft hum, revealing the yellow Lamborghini, no longer a symbol of unattainable wealth, but the frame for the first photograph of their family. He stopped before it, turning to face Helena, the car's glow illuminating their faces. "It was here," he said, his voice low and thick with emotion. "The best investment of my life wasn't in stocks or treasury bonds. It was right here, on this floor, making engine noises to see two little boys smile. The greatest dividend I ever received was the sound of their laughter." Helena raised her free hand to his face, her thumb caressing the line of his jaw. "And it was here that I felt the floor disappear in fear," she confessed in a whisper. "And in the same instant, it was where I found hope that my sons could be happy again. I looked at you and saw not a millionaire, but a man who spoke their language." They looked at each other, and in the polished reflection of the yellow paint, they saw the image their future held. Two people from different worlds, united by the courage to improvise love. And then, in the final minute of that long 7-week journey, he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of sweeping passion, but of recognition. It was a kiss that held the relief of forgiveness, the gratitude of a second chance, and the silent promise of a lifetime of shared breakfasts. It was the confirmation that true net worth wasn't stored in vaults, but built in acts of care. The nights that once smelled of imported flowers and loneliness now carried the scent of warm pound cake, fresh from the oven. On Sundays, the massive iron gates, which once intimidated and separated, now opened for sensory workshops, welcoming the neighborhood children into a garden that had learned to live with the sound of laughter and bare feet on the grass. There was no magic solution, no fairy tale ending where all problems vanished. There was the reality of a family inventing itself each day at the cost of much conversation, routine adjustments, and infinite patience. There was a love that learns, a justice that is built, and a happiness that is earned, one magnet at a time. Arthur Prado's greatest deal wasn't a positive cash flow, but the discovery that true wealth was having somewhere to come home to at the end of the day, because sometimes the right picture reveals the family your heart already knew was there.